So I read modern philosophy. I read the books on the self. I read books on the universe, the cosmos, how it's formed. I read atheistic works. Like I read Dawkins, Hitchens, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, The Four Horsemen of Atheism, where, Richard Dawkins goes famously, he's like, God is the most, homophobic, xenophobic, transphobic, like all the phobics, right? Like he's just,
Right.
like, God is just the worst. Christopher Hitchens was, who's still a favorite of mine, just he's sassy. Ernest Becker, Friedrich Nietzsche. Like I dove into, and I read New Testament scholarship. I read N.T. Wright. I read, oh gosh, William Lane Craig.
Oh,
There's a for you who is, if you watch William Lane Craig, he is dynamic. He is deep. I mean, he is so
mhm.
philosophical. And I was evaluating I was like, okay, my first primary question is Christianity true? Are any other religions like on par with this? And come to find out, being the guy, like I want to embrace truth. I want to embrace what is true. I don't want to believe a thing because I want it to be true. I need it to be true. I need the real thing. I need real community. I need real people. I need realness. And when I look at Christianity, I was absolutely shocked at how strong the evidence was. I mean, you think about just like the historical arguments for Jesus. Like you read the skeptics of the New Testament, they all affirm that Jesus died. They all affirm he was crucified under the charges of blasphemy. They all affirm that the disciples had appearances of him after he was dead. They weren't hallucinations. They weren't like made up. Like the disciples had no motivations to make it up. They
Mhm.
had every other reason to believe. I mean, we're talking a Jewish culture that was so monotheistic that they would not even write the name of God. And yet, there they are professing a man is God. That
Yeah.
was utterly, completely foreign to Jewish understanding. Like, they believed when God came down that he would enact the inaugural kingdom, he'd kick Rome out, they would get rid of all the Gentiles and all this stuff. And that's not the way God came. It was utterly contradictory and otherworldly and counterintuitive to the thinking of the time, right?
Mhm.
And I look at this and like there's the disciples every reason to deny the resurrection. I look at the disciples and look at them and the way they died. They never once recanted what they saw. They went and died. I mean, if you know this, grisly deaths,
Mhm.
unbelievable deaths. And they did it happily, arguably better than Jesus. I mean, Jesus is there struggling. He's sweating blood. Like he's like, let this cup pass. But let your will be done. Like, let this cup pass. Like, I don't want to go through this. I don't want
Yeah.
this. And there's the disciples. They're like, yeah, if you're making up a story, you would not depict the head of your religion dying in that fashion,
No.
right? Dying in utter humiliation. And then you look at the
And for his
eyewitnesses.
follower, one of his followers, to be excited to be crucified upside down.
Yeah, that was Peter. He's like, I'm
Hmm.
unworthy in the manner to die in the same way as the Savior. I
Yeah.
rather be crucified upside down. I cannot believe that. Oh,
No.
and you look at just the rationale. Like, if you're doing this for your benefit, if you're doing this for fame, if you're doing this for money, you wouldn't pick a religion like Christianity. You would have made something like the cults at the time, or you would be like the Zealots, or you would be like one of the pagan cults. Or it wouldn't work like this. And you certainly want to go against Rome, because Rome not only had the purse, but they had the sword. And Rome did everything they could in the couple centuries preceding Christianity to snuff this movement out. The Sanhedrin, the Jews. I mean, the Jews even acknowledged that Jesus performed miracles. They're like, yeah, Jesus is a magician. Wait, so you're not denying the fact that he's doing these things? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, he's a sorcerer. He's of Satan. And I was like, oh, interesting. And those are things I noticed. And those are things like I read up on other authors, they noticed too. And I was like, yeah, like, what do you do with this? And then I look at things like, okay, apart from Christianity, like, can we know there's a God, right? And I look at the universe and how fantastically improbable it was created. like I really tripped up on the idea of evolution because it was ingrained in us evolution is true, and if you deny it, you're a weird person, you're a bad person, you're a stupid person. And I look at there was a neat book. I don't recommend anyone reads this because it's so boring, right? It's called The Anthropic Cosmological Principle by John Barrow and Frank Tipler, written in the 80s. These guys are not believers, but they talk about the improbability of evolution occurring by chance alone. And they did it to the degree where they list out 10 steps, and each of which is so improbable, it would have taken so much time, the sun would have ceased to be a main sequence star. They actually did like a math formula of it. It was like, when you break it down, it's 0.0000000, like a million zeros later, one, for evolution to be successful. So if it did happen the way modern biology says it does, it would literally be a miracle, thus proving the existence of God. Now, Frank Tipler and John Barrow are like, well, it must have occurred by chance alone, otherwise we wouldn't be here. And it's like, that's begging the question. That's like me being lined up and sentenced to death, blindfolded with 100 trained marksmen, point blank range, and they all fire and miss. And I wouldn't sit there and be like, God, it's that 0.00001, million zeros later. It just must have happened by chance. Lucky me. No, you would logically conclude this was intentional. This was by design. That's why, like, when Christians are like, "Oh, evolution," and it's so bad, I'm like, well, even if it is true or it isn't, I don't know. I know God created the world. That much is certain. But even if it is true, that's the strongest argument for the existence of God because it's not an unguided process. The improbability of it happening alone by chance is so fantastical that there had to have been a hand in it. There had to have been a hand in it. And those are the things I was freaking confronted. It was hitting. And I would talk to Greg all the time about it. And Greg gave me, the superficial. I remember I took a class with him. And he taught a class called Philosophy of Atheism. And I thought it was going to be, and I like Greg, and there were some things I didn't like about his classes. When I took that class, it was an apostate class. The intention was, day one, he said, his quotes, is to deconvert us from any religious views, to make it, it was an apostate class, right? That was his intention. And I was the only one that got out of there because I was not convinced. And he later told me when I saw him at a football game, when I went and visit, he was like, "You're the one that got away. You were the only." I'm like, "Yeah, because it doesn't make sense, Greg." Like we were talking about morality, and I'll never forget. They were trying because in atheism you have to believe everything was an aid to survivability. If you assume the evolutionary model, everything is an aid to survivability. That's the whole purpose for us to survive. Well, that would include objective moral values and duties. Things are relative to the person. Like I have morality because it makes me feel good or helps with my survivability. I don't kill people. I don't want them to kill me, that sort of thing. But that morality is relative to each person. So there's no good or evil in atheism, right? There's nothing objectively wrong or objectively good. So, for example, Michael Roos, an evolutionary biologist, his words, not mine, he says that there is no moral difference between somebody who thinks 2 plus 2 equals 5 versus somebody raping and killing a child. His words, not mine.
Goodness.
That is the full consequence of atheism. There's no truth, there's no morality, which flies in the face of logic because if I say there's no truth, how do I know that's true?
Exactly. Exactly.
Like, right? And I had this discussion with students in a very, because I have to be careful because I'm a public school teacher. I don't go the religious side. I'm like, do you guys think things are truly good or truly bad? All of them said, no, like it's all relative. My opinion. I'm like, really? Did what the Nazis did in World War II was truly evil? Right? Was it truly evil? Well, yes, of course. Then you are assuming a higher standard of your own that is not of society, that is not of culture, that is not of you, right? An atheist would say, well, like they were just a product of their society and they didn't know what they were truly doing was wrong and, it wasn't truly evil. Then we had no right to kill them at Nuremberg because we killed people for that. We executed them and we said, you violated a universal human right. That wasn't in the
By
law.
that standard, though, also like the Nazis hid their crimes. Like
Yes.
they
So
were
that's the
the.
point I make. You're so smart.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Not that
Well,
smart,
no,
but
like
yes.
at the end of World War II, they were trying to destroy as much evidence as possible to cover up the Holocaust. Why would they do that if they didn't know it was wrong?
Hmm.
Why would they do that? Right?
Yeah.
Or they were trying to, blame shift or, oh, we were just following orders. And, it's like they're
Hmm.
assuming a higher morality. Anytime you say you ought not to do something, you're implying a standard beyond yourself. Like you ought to live, even our own stupid moral codes and laws that we create and think, oh, this is my moral code. I don't need the Bible. It's like every time you tell someone you ought not to discriminate against other people, that's assuming a higher standard. And moral relatives would say, well, you can't impose your white individualistic thinking upon me. That's the way you think. This is the way I think.
Hmm.
Because if you find that repugnant, I suggest that you need to change what you believe in. As what I eventually did, because life didn't make sense when you just assume there are no objective moral values and duties. Now, if there are objective moral values and duties, it naturally flows that God exists. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. And then the second premise would be, well, objective moral values and duties do exist. There are things that are truly wrong or good. Therefore, it follows that God exists because where does that standard come from? It's got to be something religious.